Okay, without further ado, let me say that tonight we're going to have a little respite from the difficult topics that we've been dealing with recently. All along, there's been an understanding that at some point we would get round to the question which was sort of simmering: what's the relationship or the conflict between private and public prayer? So I thought this was an opportunity to begin, to embark at least on that topic. There's so many ways, though, one can approach it. The most obvious is, of course, to begin in the Torah and to go through all the places where the Torah narrates incidents where people prayed. But then I realized that in the Torah, it's always ad hoc. Prayer is almost by definition something that people are moved to do because of circumstances or something else that's going on in their lives. So I thought, let's switch it. Let's begin in the later sources, which come from a period after the men of the Great Assembly. You remember, we read the passage in Maimonides where he gives an overview of the history when the men of the Great Assembly lived and what their task was to compose kind of proto-liturgy, which means that prior to that date, there was no such thing. And indeed, that will be confirmed when we look at the biblical texts, I hope, in the future. And we shall see that it's only in the very late biblical texts, if you like, Second Temple texts, where there are perhaps some foreshadowings of public prayer, but not really before that. We must also bear in mind that we could distinguish between public prayer, which is itself extempore, and public prayer that has some formulae to fall back on. You could have people coming together and the leader decides what we all want to pray for today, and he will say that out loudly and everyone joins in or says Amen. And it doesn't mean that they necessarily were familiar with the particular formula that the precentor is using on that occasion. So we must remember that distinction. So yes, it's private versus public, but within the public domain, there can also be two different paradigms. Okay, having said that, we're going to go back to the Rambam. When I say go back, because I just alluded to his review of the history, right before he gives the description of the Great Assembly and their contribution, he tells us what happened before that. And that's the first and second halakha, or halachot, of his chapter, first chapter on prayer, which we're going to read now. So whoever has the source sheet can follow. It's source number 1, and as usual, I'll read it in the English. Those who want to follow in the Hebrew have that original in front of them. So Maimonides says, to pray daily is an affirmative mitzvah, as it says, and ye shall serve the Lord your God. Exodus 23:25. The service here referred to, according to the teaching of tradition, is prayer. How do we know that? Because elsewhere it says to serve him with all your heart. That's in Deuteronomy, on which the sages commented, what may be described as service of the heart? Prayer. So Rambam derives from scripture a clear urging for people to pray. And it's called Avodah. Now, there's certain things we have to go back and dwell on a little bit in more detail. The number of prayers is not prescribed in the Torah, nor is any form of prayer prescribed in the Torah. Neither does the Torah prescribe a fixed time for prayer. All right? The Kesef Mishneh is a commentary on Maimonides' great code, and its author was Yosef Karo, who also wrote a commentary on the Torah, which is called Bet Yosef, and then a popular book called Shulchan Aruch. But arguably, his most important and monumental work is his commentary on Maimonides, because he brings to bear rabbinic sources, ancient sources. When he comments on the Torah, I suppose it's less interesting because he's quoting people closer to his time. In other words, medieval writers and much more recent material. Occasionally, he will quote the Talmud, but the Rambam is long before the Torah, hundreds of years before. So we're in a very different time frame, which in itself makes it so very important, this commentary. And he touches upon many, many issues that are raised by this passage. First, he refers us to Nachmanides, who said, I don't think prayer is a mitzvah midoraita from the Torah. And Nachmanides quoted two passages in the Talmud, which led him to that conclusion. And the Bet Yosef brilliantly parries Nachmanides' objections to Maimonides and says, no, what those texts are talking about are the fixed prayers of Anshe Kines HaGedolah, which is of course the Rabbanan, which is of course rabbinic. Although it doesn't say so explicitly in those rabbinic sources, in those Talmudic sources, but the Bet Yosef is saying they could just as well be understood that way and not referring to prayer in general. And Maimonides, therefore, ignored those two or three passages in the Talmud, which say Tefillah de Rabbanan, and addressed the major ones, which are the ones he quoted. A verse from the Torah, and that's much stronger. And then he quotes several other sources in the Talmud, all of which bolster the view of Maimonides. Anyway, we're not going to decide that machloket, that old dispute here tonight. Then he homes in on another point. He says, Maimonides tells us no prescribed times for prayer in the Torah. Yet, he starts off by saying to pray daily, or in the Hebrew, palel b'chol yom, is an affirmative mitzvah. Where on earth did he get that from? Where does it say daily? And this he really is not able to answer at all. He just says rhetorically, well, I suppose Maimonides thought that if the Torah was just saying everyone should pray, does it mean once in a lifetime? Obviously a rhetorical question. He left it at that. He had no answer of where Maimonides got this idea from of daily. And if the Bet Yosef cannot answer it, I don't know if anyone else has been able to answer this question. They all really follow in his footsteps and say that that is where he got it from. Rambam reasoned that if I don't say daily, then what does it mean? Analogously with tefillin. Now, where does it say when tefillin should be worn? The Talmud has a debate on whether people should lay tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Very big debate. Some Tanaim said yes, some said no. But nowhere does it say that people should wear tefillin every day. They should wear tefillin. And it seems that in ancient times, people did not wear tefillin every day. In fact, there is one passage in the Talmud, it's a very famous one, which says if someone is not like a man called Elisha, Baal Kenafayim, who lived a very pure and ascetic kind of life, he shouldn't wear tefillin. And it seems that in Spain, they did not lay tefillin for that reason. They thought should only put on tefillin when one is in that right frame, bodily and mentally and spiritually. So it was not done all that often. And to this day, in some communities, there's this curiosity that men put on tefillin during the mincha of Erev Kippur. So the day before Kippur, in the afternoon, they put on tefillin. And people don't know where this comes from. It's in some Sephardic communities, and it's because they were not wearing tefillin the whole year. And this was a weekday when they came to shul, so it was an opportunity to put on tefillin when they were all in a proper frame of mind and of purity. Anyway, that's by the by. So it's certainly possible that Rambam could have said a person should pray le'et mitzvah, just as putting on tefillin, giving charity. It's a wonderful thing to do it all the time, but there is no elu devarim she'en lehem shi'ur. Certain things don't have a fixed quantitative minimum or maximum. And so on Shabbat, people can't give, certainly not money. They can feed people, they can do charity in a different way. So there are certain limitations, but it's kind of the more the merrier again. So with prayer, one might have thought it was the same thing. And some say that is what the Rambam meant. B'chol yom means continually. It doesn't mean literally. Very often in the Talmud, the expression b'chol yom means regularly. I'm not going to cite the examples now because they're too numerous. Just everywhere, examples where the Talmud uses the expression b'chol yom, and it means continually, not continuously, but continually. And it could be sporadic. Okay. Let's go on with the next paragraph. Halacha bet. Hence, women and slaves are under an obligation to pray, this being a mitzvah, the fulfillment of which is independent of a set time. The obligation in this precept is that people should daily, again, according to their ability, offer up supplication and prayer, first uttering God's praises, then with humble supplication and petition, ask for all they need, and finally offer praise and thanksgiving to the Eternal for the benefits already bestowed. So the first bit, of course, is somewhat unsettling for people nowadays, and we should not pretend that it isn't or that it shouldn't be. This general rule that women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot. The Rambam took that as normative, and there are many places in the Talmud where it seems to be taken as almost for granted. But it wasn't so simple, and Tanaim had to debate it fiercely. And in the end, the Rambam himself shows that the rule doesn't hold and was certainly not accepted by all those Tanaim who included women in mitzvot, Shazimah Gerama, and excluded them from mitzvot which are not time-bound. Some even said they're exempt from studying Torah, which is extraordinary. In no way can that be reconciled with this general rule of thumb that that is the dividing line, Zeman Gerama and Zeman Gerama. But that's not what we're discussing now. The other thing that people find offensive is that, of course, by saying women and slaves, the Rambam is endorsing the institution of slavery, which we cannot gloss over. Some people think because it's in some of our sources and it's treated as a matter of course, therefore we can behave in the same way, and for us it can also be a matter of course. Well, I hope there aren't too many people who think that way. Unfortunately, I know there are some who say slavery cannot be criticized outright because the Bible and the Talmud seem to approve of it, or at least tolerate it, and mostly don't condemn it outright, except of course for Isaiah, who says, Chol motat enateku, he tried hard to do away and abolish slavery. But there were other voices, unfortunately, who opposed him. And therefore, much of his great program was left in abeyance. Maybe people today will pick it up and study it again very carefully, what he was really saying. Anyway, the Rambam has a lot of Hilchot Avadim, etc. So we have to accept that he did not seem to have a great problem with it. He ameliorated, as did the Talmud before him, the status of slaves, but did not outlaw the institution. So we're stuck with it, and then equated women with slaves. Anyway, all those things are here assumed in Maimonides. We don't assume them, therefore we have to spell them out as very strange anomalies that were accepted, as I said, as normal once upon a time in the world, and not always, and not by all teachers in Israel. Okay. Now we go back to the Talmud. Source number 2. Perhaps before we should go on, I should state the obvious, that of course, there's nothing here in these two passages of Maimonides about public prayer. because he's talking about what the Torah envisaged. And the Torah did not envisage such a thing. As we know, tells us that goes back no earlier than the Great Assembly, which was an early Second Temple period sort of fraternity, came together and decided to formulate prayers for use in synagogues. So this is, again, we're back at the Mishnah. Rabban Gamliel says, each day a person prays 18 blessings. Rabbi Yoshua says, an abridged version of 18 blessings. Rabbi Akiva says, kind of compromise, if fluent in one's prayer, one prays 18 blessings. If not, an abridged version of the 18. So this refers to what we call the Amidah, which has in it, or had in it 18 blessings. Later, another one was added, but originally 18 blessings. And according to Maimonides, this prayer containing 18 blessings was the prayer formulated by Anshe Knesset Gedolah. And that's also according to the Gemara in Megillah and in Brachot, a few places. It attributes the 18 blessings, not verbatim as we have them, but some kind of formulation. So according to Rabbi Gamliel, every day people should say those 18 blessings. Rabbi Yeshua says no, an abridged form. So what is the abridged form? So there are two opinions in the Gemara. Rav says, Me'en kol beracha bracha, u'shmuel amar habinenu. So Rav leaves it to the individual to abridge the brachot the best way he can, but doesn't offer an exact formulation. Shmuel is very generous, and he actually gives a prayer which is called Habinenu in full. Some think Shmuel did not compose it, but it was much, much older, a prayer called Habinenu. And it's a very precious prayer because we don't have that many which are actually given in full in the Talmud. We have Vatodi'enu, which is said on Motzei Shabbat. If the Sunday is a festival day, then the transition from Shabbat to a weekday, which is also a festival, is marked by this prayer Vatodi'enu, which actually is also given in full in the Talmud. And the Talmud says this is a marganita, this is like a gem about Vatodi'enu. And one can say the same about Habinenu, because it's so rare. They didn't usually give us the full formulation. They more or less left it to people. They said, pray for this, pray for that, pray for rain, pray for health, but they didn't always, or perhaps mostly, they did not give us words. So we have three opinions here. And Rabbi Akiva's was accepted by later authorities, and that's what we have today. The Rambam will also, and Shulchan Aruch, they will all codify this law that if a person is able to, it's preferable to say the 18 full brachot. If not, Habinenu. Now comes a fourth opinion in the next Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says, whoever makes their prayer fixed, their prayer is not supplication. Now this is somewhat cryptic. What do these words mean? Whoever makes their prayer fixed. So we're going to look at a commentary, an important commentary called Melechet Shlomo by a Yemenite rabbi called Shlomo Adami. He moved to the Holy Land, which is where he died around 1625. We don't have a translation, but I'll sort of translate. So, Aseh Tefilato Keva, whoever makes their prayer fixed. The Gemara asks, what does fixed mean? And there were two answers given. Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi said one thing, anyone to whom his prayer appears as a burden. And his colleagues who disagreed with him said, no, a person who doesn't pray with words of supplication. What's going on here? They don't want to tell you the truth, what keva means, and they're coming up with midrashic interpretations. A few years ago, a book appeared called Kavanah, that was the title, by a man called Seth Kadish. It's quite a fat book. And I read parts of that book because I was most curious to see how he would deal with this Mishnah. And he was insightful enough to see that these two opinions in the Talmud were trying, as it were, to camouflage Rabbi Eliezer's words. They wanted him to say what he didn't say. And this is of crucial importance. The way they explained it is, as I say, pure midrash. He didn't say kol shetivela domeh alav. So he was criticizing someone whose prayer seems to him like a burden. And besides, why is it placed here then? If this was some kind of pietistic advice, it belongs in Pirkei Avot, not here. It's presented as a fourth opinion. First Rabbi Gamliel, then Rabbi Yoshua, then Rabbi Akiva, and then Rabbi Eliezer. So I think most people who read these two interpretations in the Talmud understand this is apologetics and that there's something going on here. They don't want to admit what is really being said. So now he quotes Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah was someone who lived in Spain, a younger contemporary of Nachmanides. So he died, I think, around 1260 something, 1263, I think. He wrote in the name of Hai Gaon, the rabbis who say that he must say it in a supplicatory tone or supplicatory language, they must hold, even if his prayer seemed to him like a burden, that's all right, that's fine, as long as he says it in a gentle tone. And vice versa, the one who says the only objectionable thing is praying, as if without the supplicatory tone, he would say that if you pray like one for whom it's a burden, it's okay. So already Rabbeinu Yonah is, as it were, exposing the great difficulty of these opinions. So Rabbi Shlomo Adami, I think himself, realizes that they're totally unsatisfactory. Rabbeinu Yonah has pretty much put his finger on it, almost making it absurd. So then he quotes Hacham Rabbi Yosef Ashkenazi. Who was Yosef Ashkenazi? A very interesting, colorful character. Born in Prague, we don't know exactly when, they think around 1530. So then he would have been a contemporary of the famous Maharal, also lived in Prague. Then he moved to Italy because he was not popular in Prague since he opposed philosophy and Kabbalah. So he seems to have been quite a cantankerous gentleman, and he left. We don't know the exact reason, but in general, he was not welcome. He stayed in Italy for some years and then finally landed up in Tzfat, where he came into contact with the Ari and became quite friendly with the Ari. And he died just 2 years before the Ari in 1570. So he also didn't live very long, as the Ari also died young. Anyway, he spent a lot of time and energy studying Mishnah. And he was really an expert on the Mishnah, more than any other text. Some said he knew the whole Mishnah by heart. In any case, he looked at manuscripts and tried to establish the correct girsa, the correct reading. And he made a great contribution because in his day, there were plenty of manuscripts around which since gone missing or lost. And he wrote down what he found in these manuscripts. So his writings, from that point of view, are very valuable. So now Adani is quoting this Yosef Ashkenazi. He said, Rabbi Eliezer refers back to the 3 opinions we read in the previous Mishnah, and he disagrees with every one of them. And he says, don't make any fixture for prayer, not 18, not an abridged 18, not anything else, because anyone who makes any kind of fixture for his prayer is not really prayers at all. Now, despite the later rabbis trying to muffle this whole opinion, it survived in Avot, believe it or not. Rabbi Shimon said, be careful with the reading of Shema and with prayer. And when you pray, do not make your prayer fixed, but a plea for mercy and grace before God. As it says, he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, and renouncing punishment. And then he added another 3rd piece of advice, and be not wicked in your own eyes. It's general advice to people, because some people did do that. They were so self-effacing that they really started to believe that they were worse than they were. And that didn't lead to very good outcomes. Because if people hate themselves, they're not going to be very nice to those around them. Anyway, we're interested in the middle statement. Do not make your prayer fixed, but a plea for mercy. So Rabbi Shimon says it's either or, just like Rabbi Eliezer. And he sheds light on Rabbi Eliezer and confirms Rabbi Yosef Ashkenazi. He was right, the great Pashtan, because he says, Ella. If you look in the Hebrew, Alta says, Ella Rahamim. Very clear choice, either or. If you make it Keva, it's not going to be Tefillah with the Hanonim. It's not going to be what the Prophet wanted. It's not biblical prayer. And those rabbis who tried to camouflage this teaching, they were doing it because they wanted to encourage public synagogue services, because that was important to them, the communal cohesion, getting people to come together, because shul is much more than a place to pray. People didn't know, no telephone, no contact. People came to shul. Someone didn't come, you could inquire, are they sick? Why aren't they here? In fact, the Talmud says this in Berachot. It's a beautiful, typical Agadic statement. If someone comes to shul regularly and one day he doesn't come, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sho'el b'shlomo. What does that mean? God inquires after his well-being, or her well-being. That means, of course, that we have to inquire, since we are supposed to imitate God's ways of mercy. It means that if someone doesn't come and was expected to, then we have to go check out, is the person all right? Are there problems? It happened once in our shul that a very regular person didn't turn up and didn't come even on I think it was a festival. And I said to myself, Talmud tells us, Shoel b'shlomo, we have to find out. So I went to his home. And what a good thing it was. The wife came to the door and says, why are you coming here? I said, to inquire after your husband. And she said, no, you're not. I said, how do you mean I'm not? That's why I came, to ask how he is, because we didn't see him. She said, you're not interested in my husband, nor is anybody interested in him. I said, why do you say that? He said, well, your grandfather told him he could get lost, and that we don't need in our shul people like him. I said, well, that's a most extraordinary story, because both my grandfathers died long before I was born, and they're certainly not alive now, and they could not possibly have told him anything. So this is complete fiction. Oh no, she said, he knows what he heard. So anyway, he was in there and she called him and said, there must be some misunderstanding. And then he came, and it turned out there was one crazy man who happened to be in our shul. It's always a problem when you have crazy people. And he was very old and nobody wanted to be nasty to him. So what do? Sometimes you're tolerant of difficult people and then they go and upset other people. This is shul politics, which every rabbi and every person who has to run a shul knows all about it. But that was unfortunate, but thankfully, then he understood and he came back and everything ended happily. But what a wonderful piece of advice the Talmud gave, that we should inquire after people if they don't turn up today. It's easier to pick up a phone. I didn't have a phone number for those people. I don't know if they had a phone. I guess they did. Anyway, that's only to show why some rabbis wanted the tefillah b'tzibur, not because they belittled private prayer, but because they thought that communal getting together had many, many other benefits. Okay, let's get back to prayer. Now we have a nice story. The rabbis taught in a Baraita. It happened that a certain student went down before the ark in the presence of Rabbi Eliezer, and he prolonged the service excessively, upon which Rabbi Eliezer's student said to him, our teacher, what a prolonger this person is. He said to them, does he prolong his prayers more than our teacher Moses, about whom it is written, and I threw myself down before the Lord, 40 days and 40 nights. In other words, Moses said in Deuteronomy, I prayed for whatever that means. I threw myself down. Really, at Nepal, it's also an expression for prayer. Again, it happened that a certain student went down to lead the prayer service in the presence of Rabbi Eliezer, and he abbreviated the service excessively, upon which, again, the students complained, what an abbreviator he is. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, does he then abbreviate his prayers more than our teacher Moses? For it is written, when Moses prayed for Miriam to be healed, he said simply, please God, please heal her. Of course, this is one of the biblical prayers, which we're going to talk about when we get to the Bible. But now we happen to stumble upon it. Rabbi Jacob added, in the name of Rav Chisda, one who seeks divine mercy for a friend need not mention the friend's name. For when Moses prayed for Miriam, he said, please God, please heal her, without mentioning Miriam's name. Now, you see obviously the connection between these stories, pair of stories, and Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah. We see that in his synagogue there was no keva, and one person was leading the service and went on and on and on. Another one, very, very brief, said perhaps 5 or 6 words, and that was the whole prayer. And Rabbi Eliezer defended it because he doesn't believe in keva. Again, those who try to cover up and are in denial about history, they don't like this story at all. So they give all kinds of explanations, but they can't get away from the simple fact that this was Rabbi Eliezer, this was his shul, and he doesn't object when one person spontaneously, and I suppose the community were mostly happy. It seems that only one student protested, and then the next time another student protested. But by and large, this must have been the norm in Rabbi Eliezer's circle. The prayer was not keva. So that's a very, very important piece of evidence. Okay. Source number 6. Benjamin the shepherd. This is talking now about Hakham Isaac. So it's in a later perek of Brachot. Ate bread and said, as the after blessing, blessed is the master of this bread. Rav said he has fulfilled the obligation of reciting Birkat HaMazon. The Gemara questions this ruling. Didn't Rav say any blessing in which there is no mention of the name of God is not a valid blessing? The Gemara answers, he, Benjamin the shepherd, actually said, blessed is the merciful one, the master of this bread. The word actually is not in the Talmud. This is supplied by ArtScroll. I left it there because it's typical of many translators. It just says, De Amar, which is presumably he said, and not actually he said, which is very different. This is a formal reconciliation. Rav said that bracha was fine because he said Mare de Haipita, and Mare de Haipita is, of course, God. But others were sticklers and they thought that's not good enough. So they wanted to insert Rachamana. Maybe he did say Rachamana, maybe he didn't. It doesn't matter. What we have here again is a spontaneous bracha. It's not a prayer, it's a kind of prayer because we have tefillah, as Rambam told us, is divided into 3 classifications. Shevach, Akasha, and Hoda'ah is the third segment of prayer. And so this is a prayer. Birkat Hamazon is a prayer. This was not, again, something terribly formal, and Rav said it was fine, and that's what people will say. Again, the story. This one, a little longer. Before we embark on it, I should say a few words about rain fasts and rain services. The whole Perek of Ta'anit, or maybe more than a whole Perek, deals with those special fast days that were called rain fasts. And it may be that the 18 brachot, as we know them, started in that context of these public fasts, because Talmud describes them as they took place in temple times. And they had crowds who came into the street or into the square, the town square, because they didn't have buildings that could hold all these people. And they were all fasting, and it was a whole ritual. And they had a sermon. It's very, very interesting. And all those who are interested in ancient liturgy, they study these texts very closely. Also those who study prayer, not liturgy, but prayer, also are fascinated by these stories, because it tells you that people perhaps believed in the power of prayer. You remember we spoke about this at the beginning, right at the beginning, we spoke about this term. And we said it is not a biblical concept at all. Prayer has no power. Prayer is just a vehicle for speaking to the Almighty. And we'll see in this very Agadah, this very story, that words are not the only way of communicating with the Lord. There are other ways. However, they were very popular. People were very distressed. You can imagine, no rain, and the rainy season in the Holy Land is from Mar Cheshvan until Pesach, roughly. And if rain doesn't come throughout that period, it spells famine. So they would get very concerned, and you can imagine this was a way of taking off some of the great anxiety. So there was a wonderful idea, again, an important social event where everyone could come together and pour out their hearts before Hashem and speak about their suffering and what it meant, the drought, and so on. So some beautiful prayers were composed in that connection, the most public of all public services. So Rabbah decreed a fast because there was no rain. He prayed for mercy, but the rains did not come. They said to him, when Rabbi Yehuda decreed a fast, the rains came. He said to them, what shall I do? If you think this is because the study of Torah, which was greater in Rabbi Yehuda's day, in fact, we are superior to them. How so? In Rabbi Yehuda's time, all the teaching was in Nezikin. Nezikin is what we call today Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra. It used to be called Masechet Nezikin. Whereas we are well versed in all 6 orders of the Mishnah. Moreover, when Rabbi Yehuda would reach Okasin, where it says if a woman is preserving a vegetable in a pot, and others say olives that one preserved together with their leaves, atahor. This is about ritual purity. And oketz means the stem of a fruit or of a vegetable. And the stem is not usually edible. On certain fruits, it's not. Nevertheless, it's attached to the edible fruit or vegetable. And there's such a thing as tumat ochlim, very complicated laws, ritual purity to which food is susceptible. Well, what about the stems? They're not really food, but they're attached. So these are the kind of discussions you get in Okatzin. And when he came to these texts, he would say, I see here the analyses of Rav Ushmael. In other words, I wish we had here Rav Ushmael to explain these things to us. I'm at a loss. I don't understand what's going on here. So you see, Rav Yehuda didn't know very much about Okatzin at all. Nevertheless, when Rav Yehuda would remove one shoe, the rains would come. He says when he would remove. I think it may mean it happened once, that when he removed his shoe. I told you in this story, we have a non-verbal prayer, which is very, very interesting. A gesture that was the prayer. That also ties up with the Bible, because in a few places in the Bible, more than one, people just raised their hands to God, and that was a prayer for gesture. And that was it. They didn't speak at all. Isa kapai el Hashem. It's not necessarily accompanied by any words. It's a silent prayer. And this was a silent prayer. Why was he taking off his shoes? Because he was going to declare it a fast day of the caliber of Kippur, when we don't wear leather shoes. And it was saying things are getting desperate. And that's how he expressed it, by taking off a shoe. And he says, we cry all day and no one pays us attention. And then he goes on, if it is because of my deeds, if there is anybody who saw me do anything wrong, let them speak up. But what can the leaders of a generation do if their generation does not appear favorably in the eyes of God? So we see here Rabbah in a very awkward situation, because some members, obviously, of his congregation still believed in this idea that we've discussed before, reward and punishment. It's called the wisdom theodicy, that if people are doing everything right, then they will have good fortune, plenty of food, whatever they want. And if things go wrong for them, then you have to conclude that they are falling short and they're sinners. This was a most pernicious theodicy that was very, very hard to counter. So Rabbah finds himself in the crosshairs of this theodicy, a popular version of it. And so people are saying to him, what's wrong with you? So-and-so prayed and it rained. And look at you. You prayed, no rain. So proves that you must be a very wicked man. So he says to them, well, if you know that I did something wrong, come and correct me. He's a very humble and wonderful man, was Rabbah. But he really didn't know what to do with it. And he says, what can the leaders do if the generation doesn't appear favorable in the eyes of God? In other words, for whatever reason, arbitrary reason, God is not favoring us. But I don't think it's anything to do with us being better, or that Rabbi Yehuda was better, or his generation was better. In other words, he's pushing back against wisdom, but he's in the middle of it. Okay. So for two reasons, this is interesting. One is for the non-verbal prayer, and also because it shows that some people populists thought that somehow if a good person prays, it will happen. That's another idea that was very problematic. And contrary to Torah, where Moses said, God did not always listen to my prayers, and I was rejected. But nevertheless, this persisted, and Rabbah is fighting back. Now we come to the last one. It's a story about Choni, a sort of magic man, a man of legend. He is historical. Josephus talks about him as well, which is quite interesting, and describes him in terms very similar to the Talmud, also as a wonder man. He didn't live in Josephus's time, he lived long before. So the same legends that Talmud knew, Josephus shared. But I always think it's a mistake to doubt the historicity of people just because later legends accreted to them. Quite the contrary. If there hadn't been such people, there would have been no stories to attach to them. Almost always, people who have names and where you see certain stories which are characteristic of them, assume that they really did exist. Perhaps not quite in the fanciful way, they were remembered later. So again, he prayed for rain. No fixed prayer, which is so interesting. He lived much earlier than those Mishnayot, where you do have 18 blessings and so on. He didn't. He said his own prayers, but they were somewhat impudent. They were not appropriate. And the rabbis found it shocking, the way he expressed himself in those prayers. Shimon ben Shattach, who was the leader in his day, this is in the Hasmonean period. We know quite a lot about Shimon ben Shattach. He sent him a message. If you were not Choni, I will pronounce a ban upon you. But what shall I do to you? For you misbehave towards or ingratiate yourself with the Omnipotent, and he fulfills your wish, like a son who misbehaves towards or ingratiates himself with his father. Yet his father fulfills his wish. So I give two options here for the English because the word in the Hebrew is mitchateh. Very rare word, so it's hard to know what exactly it means. Rashi says, gives a French equivalent, which our scroll very often follows Rashi, understood to mean misbehaves, which is probably correct for that French word. So it's something to do with chet, mitchateh, which is fine. Other early commentators say no, it comes from an Aramaic word, chatyan, which means being childish. So in other words, I put ingratiates because I saw this in somewhere, in some translation rather, and I thought it's not bad, but some might prefer kidding, because if it means being like a child, then the English popular term, or almost slang word, kidding, may be the closest. But of course, we can't put that because it's not a formal English word in that sense. That's what it was. In other words, he didn't really mean to be impudent. It was tongue-in-cheek, it was banter, but he's saying he feels like a child talking to his father. So he had that close relationship, and therefore he felt that familiarity with God and could express himself in a way which many rabbis thought was going a bit far. Anyway, here we have again a personal prayer on behalf of the public, on behalf of the community. But he did it alone. not as part of a ceremony in the town square. And then Shimon added by quoting a verse from Mishlei, "Your father and mother rejoice, and she who bore you is glad." What has this to do with anything? Well, the simple meaning is that parents have a very relaxed relationship with certain children if they like them a lot. And that's what it's talking about. Be a good kid and your parents will rejoice. So he is saying that Hani Hamagel had a relationship with God as a child with father and mother, which is extremely important historically. I've written about this elsewhere, about how the mother image for God was never entirely lost. Not in the Bible and not in rabbinic writings. It's very rare, but here we see it's applied. The Maharsha says, I think, by his father, he meant his father in heaven. Well, but he refers to his heavenly parent as father and mother and the one who brought you to birth, which is quite interesting because in the Amidah, we address God in masculine terms, which again is a sore point with some people in our day, but not a topic for tonight. It's just fortuitous that we started with the Rambam saying women are exempt from such and such mitzvot, and we end the other pole where it seems perhaps Mishlei and perhaps Shimon ben Shattach are allowing the possibility of addressing God as our Father and Mother in heaven, which is pretty remarkable. Thank you. Any comments?
Yeah, I had a question for Hakham.
Yes.
And I apologize, I don't have the sources directly in front of me, but Moran says in the Shulchan Aruch that if one is going to say an extra prayer, they have to introduce a novel element into it.
Yes.
But if they're saying an extra prayer because they missed a prayer earlier, they are not required to introduce a novel element because they're fulfilling a requirement. And then much earlier, the Gemara says in Berachot around page 16 or 17, says if someone makes a mistake, they have to repeat their prayer. But if they're praying with a community, they don't have to repeat their prayer because it will be corrected in the repetition of the Amidah. So how do we reconcile these, seemingly strong halachic argument that, we have to say things a certain way and, obviously not a strong basis of that being found in Tanakh?
Well, things evolve. And there's no doubt things changed. We see it here already from just the few sources we saw tonight. So Rabbi Eliezer said, you mustn't have fixed prayers. And later rabbis tried to muffle his voice and to make him say something he never said. In fact, read into his words an impossible interpretation. And it's obvious that they were discouraging it. So they were moving in a certain direction and trying to move their communities in a certain direction. And within the Talmud, you have this all the time. It's only much later when people wanted to reconcile all voices in the Talmud, reconcile all voices in the Bible. And in the process, we lost everything. And now, hopefully, we can restore everything and allow every voice its space and its moment, and respect each voice, and not try to make everything gray and everything agree and everything harmonized. Yeah, that is very destructive. It had its place at one time for practical reasons, because they wanted uniformity. So they wanted the communities all to come together and do the same thing. That's why they were doing all this harmonizing. Today, some people don't want to grow up and they still want to live with the harmonizations. Others are willing to become adults and to think and to value every voice from the past, from the present, and look forward to the future for more voices with God's help.